Today I want to share a touching story with you. It's about a woman rebuilding her life, a quiet man with a heavy past and two children who help them all heal. If this story stirs something in you, I hope you'll carry it with you a while. Now, let me begin. The late afternoon sun slanted across the dusty plains east of Dove's Hollow, settling in golden stripes that cradled the cottonwoods just beyond the house. The rich red earth gleamed under the heat. A single crow called out before settling on a brittle branch. It was here where generations of settlers had felt the pull of both hardship and hope. Where Miriam Callahan was forging a new life for herself and her children. Miriam by the weathered window watched her son Jonah sketch the scene in charcoal, the shuttered schoolhouse, the barn's broken door, and beyond it all, the lone cottonwood leaning toward the stream. Her daughter Ruthie perched at the table chattered about the stories she'd tell that night of desert coyotes howling under silver moons and desert stars falling like rain. It was not much. But in that small house of plaster and worn pine, with failures pressed to its walls and expectations that had crumbled like stale bread, they survived. 2 springs had passed since her husband, once the town's young minister, succumbed to fever and wear. She'd believed in marrying for love, but his faith demanded more devotion than she could give. Now the doorbell rang sometimes, offering whispers upon whispers, though judgment rarely spoke so quietly. She bore their looks in measured silence. This afternoon, Jonah's pencil stuck mid-sketch. He stiffened, looking past the window. Ruthie followed his line of sight. Miriam's breath caught. A figure knelt beneath one of the cottonwoods, head slumped, shoulder heaving in pain. He wore buckskins and moccasins, both torn and dark hair hung in tangled strands. Another shape a horse stood at the water's edge, its neck bowed as though grieving. Miriam set down her teacup, still warm, and gathered Jonah's drawing and Ruthie's impatient smile. "Be kind to each other," she said softly. And they stepped outside together. The air was heavy with the scent of sun-baked earth and pool water. The children hovered behind their mother while she approached the stranger, who sat in shallow water, clutching the thigh of his leg where blood seeped through dust-covered fingers. "Ma'am," he rasped in English, so thick it dragged on the tongue. "Please." She knelt beside him, probing her own rising panic. His wounds were too old for a man just shot. Her nurse's instinct told her he'd bled until daylight. His eyes were shut, eyelashes coated in grit. "Well, all right then," she whispered. "Let's get you inside before you faint." Jonah grabbed her skirt, trembling. "Mama, is he?" "Mama said we help." Ruthie interrupted, voice a rush of pity and wonder. So into the house they brought him, legs dimpling with bruises, clothes stained with dust and darkening rust. Jonah fetched clean flannels from their only cabinet. Ruthie filled a tin basin with warm water, easy enough to heat on the stovetop. Miriam bathed his wounds gently, pressed clean cloths against them. He winced only once, sounding small and distant. At the door, a pounding echoed. Miriam froze. She hadn't expected visitors or trouble. Outside was Elias Truwell, strict, narrow-eyed, his badge gleaming faintly in the sun. He had an air of expectation, of unfinished business. Miriam steadied her breath. "Heard some timbers creak," he said quietly. "Didn't expect well." His gaze flicked between the man cradled inside and the trembling children. Miriam stood. "I'm helping a wounded man. Seems in need of aid." Elias's lips thinned. "You know who he is?" She met his gaze. "No, you." Before he answered, the stranger stirred, guttered, and Jonah gasped. Elias's jaw clenched. He nodded. "I think I can guess." And with that, he turned and walked away. Inside the fire hissed, casting shadows across the stranger's face. Miriam settled on the chair once so comfortable for two, and now held Jonah's hand instead. Ruthie leaned into her side, both children shaken in silence. The stranger's eyes opened then, pale and still. He looked at Miriam and for the first time said clearly, "Thank you." He spoke her son's name, Jonah, and smiled as if naming home. Miriam thought her heart might make its escape. "Good to know someone remembers me," she breathed. He nodded. He closed his eyes. Outside the wind bent the cottonwoods. The golden light deepened into dusk. In the silence, three souls seated in a battered cabin found themselves bound by chance, by compassion, and by hope that whispered on the desert wind. The next morning broke fallen dry, the kind of desert dawn that crept over the land with gentle indifference. The cottonwoods rustled softly outside the cabin window, though the wind itself was still and watchful. Inside the air hung with the faint scent of salves and blood. Beeswax candles and wood smoke from a restless fire that had burned all through the night. Miriam sat at the table with a cup of weak coffee, her fingers wrapped around it, more for comfort than warmth. Across from her, Jonah leaned over a sheet of paper, pencil scratching lightly. He was trying to finish the sketch he'd started the day before. The one of the strangers slumped under the trees, but his high hand hovered too long, hesitant. Is he still sleeping? Jonah finally asked, not looking up. He is, Miriam replied. Rest is the best medicine now. Ruthie tiptoed in from the back room where the stranger had been laid on the spare cot. He was talking in his sleep, she whispered. Not in English. What did it sound like? Jonah asked. Like wind on canyon walls, Ruthie said, serious. Or maybe water trying to talk. Miriam closed her eyes for a moment. That the children weren't afraid anymore frightened her more than anything else. Acceptance came so easily to them, too easily perhaps. Children didn't carry the burdens their parents did. Not yet. She stood smoothing her skirt. He needs clean dressings. Ruthie, boil the kettle. Jonah, fetch more cloth from the bottom shelf. Inside the back room, the light filtered through a torn curtain, casting a line of gold across the stranger's cheekbone. He lay still, though not limp. He held himself in sleep like a man who had learned never to truly surrender. Miriam could see that now. His chest rose and fell steadily beneath a blanket Ruthie had chosen for its colors, red and sky blue, woven with years of wear. The blood on his thigh had dried into a thick patch against the bandage. Miriam peeled it back slowly. The wound was ugly, torn rather than clean. Possibly a trap, possibly punishment. The edges of his skin had bruised in unnatural patterns, finger marks perhaps. She'd seen this sort of injury before years ago in the war hospitals. It wasn't just violence. It was message. Miriam dipped a cloth into the warm water Ruthie brought and began to clean the wound again. The man stirred but didn't wake. His hand twitched once, then fell still. Only when she was binding the leg anew did she realize he was watching her. His eyes sharp and dark as obsidian met hers, and for a second neither spoke. You stayed, he said, voice dry as wind. You needed care, Miriam answered. His gaze flicked toward the children's voices in the next room. Most would not risk their own for a stranger. Miriam pressed the edge of the bandage tighter than she needed to. I'm not most. A sealant settled between them again. This one not sharp but curious. What should I call you? She asked. He blinked slowly, considering. Nai, he said. It means wanderer. She nodded. I'm Miriam. Those are my children. Jonah, Ruthie. His voice dropped. Your husband gone. Nikai said nothing more. But the weight of his quiet was different now. It wasn't the silence of suspicion. It was the silence of someone who understood grief without needing to dissect it. By the third day, Nikai was strong enough to sit in the chair by the hearth. He didn't speak much, but Ruthie talked enough for all of them. She brought him her storybook, half drawings, half words. I write stories, she explained. Jonah draws them. This one is about a wolf who marries the moon. Nikai raised an eyebrow. The moon doesn't marry, he said gently. In stories, she does, Ruthie replied. Besides, you don't know what the moon wants. At that, something softened in Nikai's expression. He turned a page with a fingertip that bore old calluses and a fresh scar. Jonah kept his distance, watching more than speaking. That evening, he handed Nai a folded paper, his finished sketch of the cottonwood scene. You drew this? Nai asked. Jonah nodded, fingers tight at his sides. Nye studied the drawing. You see, with a careful eye. Jonah flushed but said nothing. The next morning, he was already sketching again before the rest of the house stirred. On the fifth day, Miriam caught herself humming as she stirred a pot of cornmeal. It startled her, she hadn't hummed since before Caleb fell ill. The sound echoed oddly in her ears like hearing someone else live inside her skin. She paused, wooden spoon hovering midair. Nye was watching her from the table. Why did you help me? He asked. It wasn't a confrontation. It was something else. Almost weary gratitude. Miriam looked down at the bubbling pot. Because my husband would have told me not to. Nikai's brow furrowed, waiting. He was a man of God, she said softly, but not always a man of grace. I gave up my own voice, trying to match his righteousness. She turned toward Nikai, then helping you was the first decision I've made that felt like mine in a long while. He nodded slowly. That, he said, is a reason I understand. Later that night, as the children slept and the fire burned low, Nikai sat at the table carving shapes into a piece of a discarded wood Ruthie had given him. The knife in his hand moved slowly, each motion deliberate. Miriam sat across from him with her mending, though her hands had gone still. What are you carving? She asked. A mountain, I remember. Near where my mother is buried. Is that where you're going? When you leave here? Nikai didn't look up. I don't know. She watched him for a while. Firelight catching on the curve of his cheek, the set of his jaw. He looked not just like someone who had survived, but someone still deciding what survival meant. Miriam set her sewing aside. If you choose to stay for a time, she said, well, make slice. Nakai did not smile, but he nodded, and that was enough. The days stretched warm and slow, stitched together with routines as fragile and comforting as homespun cloth. By the second week of Nikai's stay, the rhythm of life at the Callahan cabin had changed quietly, without ceremony. He rose before dawn to gather kindling or fix what Caleb had never gotten around to. Ruthie followed him like a sparrow while Jonah began sketching not just what he saw but what he imagined, scenes from Nikai's stories rendered in charcoal and earth gold inks. Miriam watched all this with the cautious gratitude of to someone afraid to name her blessings aloud. Life had not been this still since before the fever took her husband. But even then peace had felt like a duty. Now it felt like breath. Nakai moved like someone built from silence. He never asked for more than he needed. Never lingered in a room longer than invited. But in the quiet, he'd begun to teach. How to mend a fence post with patience. How to find water by watching the willows bend. How to listen to wind and know when it was carrying change. One morning, Miriam stood at the well, pumping water while the sun painted the sky with streaks of apricot. Nakai approached without sound as he always did. I mended the west fence, he said. It won't hold cattle, but it'll hold the wind. Mayam smiled faintly. That's all we need holding back these days. They stood in companionable silence for a moment until she asked, did you have family? Nakai didn't answer at first, then quietly. A sister taken during winter raids, a mother buried near the Moyan cliffs. And your father? He shook his head. Not mine long. Miriam nodded, knowing that was all he'd give for now. The quiet they built was not invincible. It cracked first in town. A week later, Miriam and the children hitched the wagon and rode into Dove's Hollow for flour and sewing needles. Nikai stayed behind by Miriam's quiet request. She knew some folks would look sideways at a white woman, bringing an Apache man to the general store, no matter his injuries or silence. As she browsed the shelves, Mrs. Thistle, the preacher's wife, approached with a tight-lipped smile. I heard you've taken someone in, she said lightly, as though commenting on the weather. Miriam didn't look up. He was wounded. Couldn't leave him to die. Mrs. Thistle tilted her head. You always had a heart for strays. Caleb said as much. The name landed like a crack of cold air. Miriam turned slowly. Yes, and I buried him with it still beating. Mrs. Thistle blinked. Just be careful, dear. People notice who walks on whose land. Miriam said nothing, but when she left the store, she saw it. Elias drew Elle across the street, arms crossed, staring with that seem-hard squint that made her feel like sin had inked itself across her face. That night, as the family ate stew in quiet communion, Miriam told Nikai what happened. She didn't want to, but silence too long can sour even peace. Someone may come asking, she said. About you? They already asked about me. Nai nodded, not surprised. They think I've fallen, she added, voice bitter. He looked at her then, and his words were like slow-burning coals. Then perhaps they never knew how high you were standing. Miriam's hand still lilled on her spoon. For a moment, her throat closed. No one ever said something like that to me, she whispered. Not without wanting something in return. I want nothing, Nikai said simply, except to be allowed to leave no more harm behind me. She looked at him across the table and she wondered, what would it mean to choose someone who asks nothing yet offers stillness, safety, truth. A few nights later, while the children slept, a knock came at the door too sharp. Too late. Miriam opened it to find Elias Truel standing on the porch, hat in hand. I've got questions, Mrs. Callahan, he said, not unkindly, but firmly. She didn't flinch. Then ask them here. Word is Alia said. You've been harboring a man who fits the description of an escapee from Fort Bay Sam. Apache late 30s. Scar on the left cheek. Miriam folded her arms. I helped a man who was dying. I didn't ask what town he came from, let alone what fort. He could be dangerous. Everyone's dangerous when they're hunted. Elias's jaw clenched. Look, Miriam, I knew Caleb. He wouldn't have stood for Caleb's not here, she said. Her voice was low, but steady. And maybe if he were, he'd be learning something new. Elias didn't argue, but as he tipped his hat and walked back into the night, the fire in his eyes wasn't gone. 2 mornings later, Nakai found a pile of ashes at the edge of the property. A dead crow lay beside it, wings scorched. Someone had left it as a warning. He brought it to Miriam without words. She looked at it, her jaw tightening. They're afraid, he said. Afraid of what? He knelt by the edge of the porch, setting the crow down carefully. Of what they can't understand, of what they cannot name without hating. Miriam sat beside him, shoulders hunched. What do I do, Nikai? If I ask you to stay, they'll call it sin. If I ask you to go, I'll be lying to myself. He didn't answer at once. Then let the children name it. They know what it is. Miriam nodded as the words breaking something open in her. That evening, Ruthie climbed into Nikai's lap with her storybook. She pointed to a new page. She'd written. It's about the man who came with wind in his coat, she said so. And the woman who stopped pretending to be Saul. Nikai looked at the pike. She had drawn his hands cupped around a sprouting seed wood. She doesn't save him, Ruthie added. He doesn't save her either. They just stop being lonely at the same time. Miriam stood at the doorway watching. She didn't cry, but something inside her exile exhaled for the first time in years. That night, as she banked the fire and watched Nikai trace a shape into the wooden table, a crescent moon, just barely visible, she realized what the fire hadn't burned. Hope. Not the kind you speak aloud, but the kind that finds a place to rest quietly beside someone who won't ask you to prove you deserve it. Miriam rose before the first coyote had finished its morning cry. She stepped quietly over the worn pine floors, past the children's room where Ruthie mumbled dreams, and Jonah curled like a seedling in winter. The hearth still held heat from the night's fire. She fed it a log, listening to the soft crackle take shape in the hush. Nye was gone, not just out in the garden or mending fence. His bedroll near the porch was neatly folded, and his carving knife, the one he carried like part of his hand, was missing. There was no note, no footprint thick enough to follow, only absence, clean and vinyl. Mayim stood in the open doorway, the morning wind pressing at her skirt. Her eyes scanned the horizon beyond the cottonwoods, the stream, the place where she first found him bent and broken. The world looked the same, but something had been taken out of it. The silence that followed filled the cabin like smoke. Ruthie asked after him first, cradling her storybook like a doll. Did he go to the mountains? He talked about. Miriam forced a steady breath. Maybe. Jonah said nothing. But that night he threw away his latest sketch of Nikai sitting in the rocking chair carving wood into ski. 3 days passed. No sign, no word. By the 5th day, Jonah stopped eating supper. Ruthie asked if Nikai had been a ghost. Miriam almost said yes. But ghosts didn't leave behind calluses on fence posts or the smell of leather in the morning sun. They didn't fix hinges or teach your child how to follow a shadow. Miriam felt her hands tremble more often. Her thoughts returned to Elias Truel, to the fire pit warning, to the look in Nikai's eyes when he'd held the dead crow. He left to protect us, she told herself. But it didn't soften the corners of the house where his Guriate used to live. One late afternoon, after sweeping the porch and folding the laundry with mechanical care, Miriam opened the trunk in the corner of her bedroom. It was cedar-lined, full of Kelb's old things. Sermons scrolled in looping ink, worn shirts that still smelled faintly of ink and ash, a Bible she hadn't touched in over a year. She turned page after page until she found a folded sheet tucked between Psalms and Lamentations. A letter never sent. I know now I married a woman stronger than I could bear. I taught righteousness, but you lived it. I wanted you to follow. You were made to lead. She read the lines 3 times before folding the letter back into the pages as is. Caleb had never spoken those words aloud. Perhaps he hadn't meant her to find them. Or perhaps in his last months he'd seen something he'd refused to see when his voice still held the power of pulpit and pews. That night, as Jonah and Ruthie slept, Miriam sat beside the fire, her hands still. She felt the absence of conversation, not as a lack, but as pressure. The memory of Nikai's voice returned not in words, but in tone. The way he had said, "Let the children name it." She understood now. She wasn't mourning love lost. She was mourning permission denied. A week later, Miriam hitched the mule, packed 2 days' provisions, and left Jonah in charge with a neighbor woman she trusted. Ruthie hugged her tightly and whispered, "Bring our story back." She followed the shallow trail Nikai had once drawn in dust northwest toward the Moayan rim. The land grew rougher. The sky stretched wider. At dusk on the 2nd day, she found a small fire near a red rock bluff, sheltered beneath an overhang that bore ancient handprints fading into sank. Nakai sat beside the flames, still as a monument, his back to her. But when she stepped close, he turned no surprise in his face, only the knowing that had always lived in his eyes. Mayam stood for a long time without speaking. Finally, "You left without a word. I thought silence would be softer than goodbye. Not for the ones left behind." He lowered his gaze. "It was the only way I knew to keep you safe." Miriam crouched beside him, placing her hand near the fire, but not touching his. "I wasn't safe before you came. I was just surviving. You knew that." He looked at her. "And you knew I'd never ask you to choose me." "I did," she said. "But I chose anyway." Silence again. But this one had a different shape rounder. More forgiving. "I'm tired," Miriam whispered. "Of waiting to be told who I am. By a preacher, by a town, even by you." Nikai closed his eyes for a moment. Then he handed her something smooth and cool. It was the wooden carving he'd been working on for weeks. The mountain, yes, but in its folds was a tiny figure, arms outstretched, facing a rising sun. She traced the lines with her fingertips. "You gave me yourself." "No," Nikai said quietly. "You found me and I remembered how to stay." They returned to the cabin together 3 days later. No announcements, no declarations, just Miriam leading the mule and Nai walking beside her. Their steps matched in dust and silence. Jonah ran to them first, his eyes wide, but not afraid. Ruthie followed with a cry of joy that cracked the air like a bell. At supper, no one asked why or how. They simply took their seats as if a chair had never been missing. That night, Miriam stood beneath the cottonwoods with Nikai beside her. The wind carried the scent of juniper and the sound of frogs from the stream. "I don't know what comes next," she said. "Then we listen," Nikai replied. She slipped her hand into his, not claiming, not clinging, simply anchoring herself to the present. The moon rose slow and golden. The wind bent the trees, and inside the house, the rooms echoed no longer. They breathed. Dove's Hollow did not erupt when Miriam returned with Nikai beside her. There were no crowds at the gate, no torches or shouted curses, only silence, a different kind than the one she'd learned to trust. The kind that gathered behind shutters and waited for things to settle. The kind that judged from a distance slowly. Miriam knew that silence well. She moved through town with her shoulders squared, her chin high, not in defiance, but with a quiet clarity. She'd found her peace in a man who asked for no ownership, in children who followed her strength, and in a truth that didn't need defending. Still the whispers came. At the dry goods store, Mrs. Thistle smiled with just her lips and folded Miriam's sugar into a torn sack. "More mouths to feed," she said lightly. At the post office, someone coughed pointedly when Nikai entered with Ruthie to mail her book, a packet of folded pages she'd carefully tied with twine titled "The Man with Wind in His Boots." But it was Elias Truwell who brought tension back into focus. He arrived one Sunday afternoon, his boots crunching on gravel, the heat beating down his neck. Nikai was working on the corral, shirt off, sweat streaking his back like paint on sanded wood. Miriam was hanging clothes on the line. The air smelled of lavender and soap. "Miriam," Elias called from the gate, hat in hand. "May I speak with you?" Nye looked up but said nothing. Miriam met Elias halfway. He glanced at the children who were seated near the porch with a bowl of sliced peaches. Then he lowered his voice. "You know what you're doing, don't you?" he asked. "Yes," Miriam said. "They're talking about taking it to the circuit judge, about custody, about fitness to raise your children." Miriam didn't blink. "On what grounds?" "Moral instability. That's the phrase I heard." He looked at her and for the first time there was something in his face that resembled concern, not judgment. "I'm not here to bring trouble, Miriam. But you're living in a matchbox. And there's a lot of folks walking around with lit torches." Miriam nodded slowly. "And if I leave him, if I send him away and pretend I never made this choice?" Elias hesitated. "It would help your case." "I'm not interested in help if it means lying," she said, voice steady. "And I'm done living by other people's shadows." He exhaled. "Then I hope your children are as strong as you are." Miriam smiled. "They already are." That evening, she told Nye everything. They sat on the steps, Ruthie asleep inside. Jonah upstairs finishing a drawing of the cottonwoods under starlight. "They'll come after me through the children," Miriam said, not as a plea, but as a truth laid bare. Nakahi stared ahead, jaw firm. "Do you want me to leave?" "No," she said instantly. "But you're afraid." "I've been afraid all my life, but that doesn't mean I don't know what I want." He looked at her, really looked, eyes tracing her face like a question. "I can't give them my name," he said softly. "Not in a way they'd write down and honor." "I'm not asking for your name," she replied. "Only your presence." He nodded once, and in that gesture was a vow stronger than paper. Later that week, Jonah brought home a bruised lip. Some older boys had cornered him near the schoolyard and called him Red Brother. One of them had pushed him. He hadn't fallen, but he hadn't fought back either. Miriam knelt beside him, dabbing gently at the mark with cool water. "Why didn't you hit him?" Jonah looked at her with his father's eyes, "But father." "Because I'm not angry, Mama." "Not really. I just feel sorry for them." Miriam blinked hard. "You know," he added after a moment. "They said I wasn't really part of a family anymore, but they're wrong." Miriam wrapped him in her arms, whispering into his hair. They are so wrong. 1 week later, they were invited to the school's autumn gathering. It was a polite gesture, a test perhaps, a public space to watch and measure. Miriam brought a pie. Ruthie carried her storybook. Jonah, after long debate, brought one of his drawings, a rough charcoal scene of their home at sunset FET with Nikai fixing a broken fence post and the children laughing nearby. Nai wore his plainest clothes, his hair was tied back. He stood beside Miriam without touching her, but his presence was unmistakable. They stayed for an hour. No one spat. No one shouted. A few folks nodded. A few more looked away. But one little boy from the younger class asked Ruthie if the man in her story was real. Yes, Ruthie said. He helps things grow. The boy blinked. Like a gardener, Ruthie thought. More like a keeper of stories and people. Miriam stood quietly behind her daughter and felt a fierce, steady warmth bloom in her chest. Back home, as twilight settled and the air turned crisp, Miriam sat by the window sewing Ruthie's worn dress. Nai was out back gathering kindling. Jonah read by candlelight, and Ruthie dozed curled on the rug with her book clutched to her chest. It struck Miriam then, simple in truth. She was no longer surviving her life. She was living it. And the love that had grown between them all, gentle, wordless, solid as cannon stone, was not something to be defended or declared. It simply was, not because it had been given a title, not because anyone outside approved, but because it endured quietly, because it had been chosen. By late October, the high desert had begun to settle into its gentler rhythm. Cooler nights, golden daylight stretched long and thin, like honey poured slow. The cottonwoods had turned pale and rustling, shedding their leaves in loose waves that gathered against the fence posts. Miriam liked the sound they made underfoot, soft and dry, like pages turning. That morning she stood barefoot on the porch, coffee in hand, wrapped in her husband's old blanket, not for sentiment, but for warmth. Inside, Nikai was mending the handle of Ruthie's small broom, his long fingers steady even in he tasks. Jonah slept upstairs, and Ruthie sat cross-legged by the hearth, humming a tune she insisted she had dreamed. The world felt close, not small. Oh, not loud. It had been nearly 3 months since Nikai arrived, longer than anyone in town expected, longer than Miriam had imagined she'd allow herself to need someone again. But there he was, sitting cross-legged on the rug, while Ruthie handed him twine, like it was precious thread spun by queens. And somehow it all made perfect sense. They lived simply on stew, boiled potatoes, flatbread, and stories. On things repaired rather than replaced, on glances that said everything, and words that waited their turn. And somehow the town had quieted, too. Mrs. Thistle no longer stared quite so long. Elias hadn't returned since the gathering. The whispers, if they still passed through lips, no longer reached their porch. It hadn't been a victory exactly. More like erosion, a slow reshaping, not unlike love. That week, a letter arrived from the county school office inviting Miriam to speak at the Founders' Day gathering. She'd taught more than 24 children in the past year, including 3 who had previously been labeled slow, and another whose father credited her for stopping his boy from running off to mine silver. It was a small honor, but public, unavoidable. That night, Miriam sat on the porch with Nikai, her knees drawn up under her skirt, the stars crisp overhead. "They want me to speak," she said, watching her breath cloud the air. "In front of everyone." He nodded. "What will you say?" "I don't know yet." She paused. "I could keep it simple. Talk about books maybe, or how children need stability." Nikai turned to her then. "Or you could tell the truth." She met his eyes, dark, deep, steady. "Which truth?" She whispered. "That peace doesn't come from quiet places. It comes when you stop asking who you're allowed to become." Miriam smiled, eyes wet. "You always find the root of the thing." "No," Nikai said. "You already know it. I just hold the mirror." On the morning of Founders' Day, the entire town gathered in the chapel and meeting hall. It had once been just a saloon with thick curtains drawn across the back, but now it had hymnals and a pulpit and the name Grace Hall painted above the doors. Miriam stood near the back smoothing her dress. It was plain brown cotton, the same she wore on Sundays, but Ruthie had insisted on tucking a yellow wildflower behind her ear. Nikai stood in the aisle, not seated his choice. He held Ruthie's hand loosely while Jonah sat beside them holding a small paper folder. When Miriam's name was called, a quiet hush settled. She walked up slowly, heart steady, not from lack of fear, but because she had chosen this. She looked out over the pews, families she knew, children she'd taught. Mrs. Thistle's sharp eyes, and even Elias Truel standing in the back corner, arms crossed. "I was asked to speak about community," Miriam began, her voice clear and even. "But I'd like to speak about families instead." A pause. "Not the ones we're born into, but the ones we make, the ones that ask not for perfection or approval, but presence." She glanced toward the aisle, met Nikai's gaze. "I lost my husband 2 years ago," she continued. "And for a long while after, I believed I was meant to live in the shadow of who I'd been with him. But grief has its own language. It teaches us slowly. And one day it taught me that love can still grow quite quietly in the corners of your life where you least expect it." There was no sound in the room, just breathing and the creak of floorboards. "I found family again, not in rings or records, but in listening, in stories, in choosing someone and letting them choose you back without needing to explain why." She paused again, then said softer, "Now, home is not walls. It's the space between hearts that learn how to stay." When she stepped down, no one clapped. Not at first, but Ruthie did. One sharp clap, then another, then Shauna, then one by one, others followed. It was not loud, it was not wild, but it was enough. That evening, back home under the painted sky, Nikai lit the fire while Miriam folded the borrowed dress. The yellow flower Ruthie had tucked behind her ear now rested on the windowsill in a glass of cool water. Jonah worked on his new drawing, this time of a white desert with 2 figures walking into it side by side. Ruthie was stringing beads into a necklace. And Nikai approached Miriam holding something small carved wood shaped into a ring. Not a wedding band, not even a gift, just a smooth circle without beginning or end. "For the days that can't speak," he said, pressing it into her palm. Mayim looked at it, then at him, and simply nodded. They never married in the eyes of the town, never placed names on plaques or signed any public declarations. But they were a family of choice, of presence, of stories told by firelight and songs hummed into dusk. And beneath the painted sky, where silence no longer hurt and rooms no longer echoed, they made something lasting, something theirs. Thank you for listening all the way to the end of the story. I'm truly glad you stayed with me. Your support means so much. Please consider giving this video a like and subscribing to the channel so I can keep bringing you more heartfelt stories like this.